LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to the January 17th edition of LiberalViewer Monday Media Mix-Up. Happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day for my viewers in the United States. Thanks for joining me. I'll be using the dozen best, most newsworthy clips from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States, for what should be a really educational, informative, fair use, media criticism, and political commentary show for you today. My main topic, as you can see from the title of the video, is Voting Rights Dead While COVID Lives Forever. And that's basically two topics, the death of voting rights legislation and the ongoing COVID pandemic. And I'll have multiple clips on both those issues. But I'm actually going to start for my political comedy is a Fox News bias clip on a topic I don't think I've really talked that much about. I don't know if you all are familiar with the word copaganda. Copaganda. If you read tweets from this guy here, Alec Karakatsanis, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, he covers the criminal justice system and he does a lot of dissection of copaganda, and unfortunately it's not just Fox News bias. It's something you see over the entire media, where a lot of times, well, this is something I know from being a criminal defense attorney, a public defender for many years, or for 5 years, is that many years, but that when you know like the inside of a lot of criminal cases in your area, you realize that when you read news stories about those criminal cases, the sources for those news stories, almost always the police and the prosecutor. They get their story out. Criminal defense attorneys, because of attorney-client privilege and because the element of surprise, not knowing what the defendant's going to say or what their story's going to be, is one of the few advantages they have on the defense. You don't see the defense leaking to the, I mean, it's not like it never happens, but 90+% of the time when you read about a criminal story, a crime story in the news, you're hearing the police and prosecutor point of view, and a lot of times it's really biased in favor of the police and prosecutors. And in fact, not only am I going to show you this Fox News bias propaganda piece from this morning, I'm going to show you how like propaganda crept into the multiple other Sunday morning news analysis shows with the coverage of this Texas synagogue standoff that happened over the weekend. The story that came out was a much more pro-cop story than what we eventually learn, or if you listen, I put a link down in the video description to the interview with the rabbi and explaining what happened. And I'll get to that when I get to those news summaries, but first I want to show you for my political comedy, the Fox News bias. This is like incredibly biased report. I've shown you before, like they do this, I don't know, sometimes multiple times a day, definitely multiple times a week. They put their stories about police harmed in the line of duty, all those police stories where police are shot at or police are killed or that kind of thing. It's police under siege, and it's a growing threat in the United States apparently, and they showed the increased number of police who died in the line of duty in 2021 as if it was this rising crime rate that was responsible for it, which I will disprove after this is just a clip from America's Newsroom. Dana Perino, former Bush press secretary, now Fox News supposedly straight news anchor, but not really, over in this clip.
Mr. Arroyos unfortunately died. It was killed. That is just one of many law enforcement officers who have lost their lives. And I'll put this up on the screen for everyone to see. The most number of officers died in 2021 in line of duty since 1930. Total deaths 458, up 65% from last year. By firearms, up 30.
And if you watch that whole story, and I put a link down in American Newsroom, I don't know if you can see the whole story, but of those 458 officers, they talk about the violent deaths. What they don't tell you about those 458 officers, if you go to the actual web page, that is the source, and you look at that, I don't know if you can read it there, but of those 458 officers who died in the line of duty in 2021, 301 of those 458 officers died from COVID. And, the COVID vaccine mandates and requiring police officers to get police officers to be vaccinated in order to continue their jobs. That's one of the hated policies on Fox News, but they don't mention how many police officers died from COVID there. So that is the, you see that kind of copaganda on Fox News all the time. But I'm going to show you when I get to the news summaries how that, like I said, in the coverage of the Texas standoff, that's in the second, third, and fourth news summaries, which I'll get to. But I want to get to the main news summary, the first news summary, the longest news summary. Chuck Todd has the best, longest package as usual, which is the pre-recorded video that he gives a live introduction to at the beginning of most of the programs, Meet the Press. And you'll see that the NBC News Meet the Press picks up this talking point I heard on Fox News all week about this is like the worst week of the Biden presidency, and talks about the death of voting rights and the death of the Build Back Better bill and COVID and the economy. And anyway, doesn't cover the Texas synagogue. I'm not sure if it's because it was recorded too early or they just didn't get to it, but the Texas synagogue standoff didn't make it into the news summary from NBC News Meet the Press that I will talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
Good Sunday morning. Every new administration enters office with an agenda of optimism. For President Biden, the plan was that COVID would be defeated, the economy would fully recover, and he would be able to deliver a return to normalcy. But plans have a way of going sideways. A year into Mr. Biden's presidency, unemployment is down, wages are up, but inflation is also up to a 40-year high. Infrastructure and COVID relief bills were passed, but Build Back Better is stuck in neutral. And most important, though vaccines are available and effective, Delta and Omicron have dealt a 1-2 punch to the economy, the supply chain, and that promised return to normalcy. And on Thursday, the Supreme Court blocked Mr. Biden's vaccine or test mandate for large businesses, perhaps taking away the last effective tool in his COVID toolbox. That same day, Mr. Biden's last-minute push for voting rights bills was dealt a likely fatal blow. Democratic Senator Kyrsten Sinema said again what she's been saying for months. She is opposed to changing the filibuster to pass this legislation. So now what? All of this came just as the president was heading, by the way, to Capitol Hill to lobby fellow Democrats to change the Senate rules. So it was quite the exclamation point on a terrible week.
This is something we did get done.
President Biden, after one of the worst weeks of his presidency, touting the infrastructure bill he signed 2 months ago.
There's a lot of talk about disappointments and things we haven't gotten done. We're going to get a lot of them done, I might add.
With the looming failure of voting rights legislation,
I will not support separate actions that worsen the underlying disease of division.
And his economic plan, Build Back Better, stalled in the Senate.
I cannot vote to continue with this piece of legislation. I just can't.
President Biden has been unable to bridge the wide gap between progressives and moderates in his own party, and is satisfying neither group.
It is about the Democratic Party trying to restore faith with the American people that they actually stand for something.
Democrats need to step up and lead this country.
Many Democrats are calling for a reset, worried a stalled legislative agenda will hurt the party, which is already facing headwinds this fall. And a year after promising a change in tone,
We can join forces, stop the shouting, and lower the temperature.
President Biden has failed so far to do that.
You want to be on the side of Dr. King or George Wallace? Do you want to be on the side of John Lewis or Bull Connor?
So much for unifying the country.
Perhaps the president went a little too far in his rhetoric.
Outside of the infrastructure bill, a significant victory, Mr. Biden has been unable to build a small coalition of governing Republicans to make the public effort at bipartisanship that some swing state Democrats have been pleading for.
I wish there had been a more serious effort on the part of Democratic Party leaders to sit down with the other party.
For the third time in just over 3 months, President Biden went to Capitol Hill in person, this time for voting rights.
The honest to God answer is, I don't know whether we can get this done.
And for a third time, walked away with nothing to announce. 1 year in, Mr. Biden has the second lowest approval rating ever measured in the White House and has never been less popular nationally.
These guys said that they were going to come in and bring competence. The only thing they've really brought into Washington is they're not Donald Trump.
President Biden successfully passed COVID relief legislation and the infrastructure bill, but has failed so far to move not just voting rights, but police reform.
Let's get it done next month.
Gun control legislation.
We can do this and save lives.
And to fulfill his promises on climate change.
We are resolving to take action.
He struggled on the chaotic Afghanistan pullout and on the economy. While a record number of jobs have been created this year, inflation is at a 40-year high.
Joe Biden is the president of high prices.
Perhaps most consequentially for November, Biden, who ran for president promising to beat COVID, has failed to beat it back.
I am concerned about the pandemic just because it worldwide is not slowing up very much.
And joining me now is Congressman Jim Clyburn of South Carolina, whose endorsement of Joe Biden was critical in helping him secure.
So, yeah, I don't have any Representative Jim Clyburn clips. He was on a couple of the programs, though he still had, basically he was saying that they're still fighting for voting rights, even though it looks like the legislation's dead. I will have Tim Kaine, Senator from Virginia, talking about that in one of the clips after I have a couple Republicans talking about it. Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana and Senator Mitt Romney from Utah. Those are the newsmaker clips I have before I get to the COVID clips, where I'll have Ashish Shah and Tom Bossert talking to Fox News Sunday and ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, respectively. But like I said, I think that was actually the best news summary of where the Biden administration is this week, and I think that it was, in this case, journalistic to talk about the bad week that Biden is having, unlike what they do on Fox News, where like every week they try to make it a bad week. And Mitt Romney, in a clip I'm not going to take, said it's not just one bad week, he's had 52 bad weeks, a year of 52 bad weeks in a row all year, which, I don't know, Mitt Romney is still a partisan Republican despite being a never Trumper, and a lot of the things he said were partisan Republican talking points. He was, after all, the Republican presidential nominee right before Trump, right? So he should represent the Republican Party more than he actually does. But anyway, the point I was trying to make is that Meet the Press actually covered the problems with the Biden presidency, despite the fact that some people say NBC is too soft on Democratic presidents, which, if you watch this show, I don't think is really true. I mean, sometimes they have their biases, but I don't really think the mainstream media has a liberal bias. It has a corporate bias. It has a bias for sensationalism, for being simplistic, for being corporate, like with pro-defense contractor, pro-oil industry, pro-establishment. Those are all like conservative biases, really. But anyway, I'm digressing off into the topic of media bias, but now I'm going to show you some media bias, and the kind I was talking about before, copaganda. And it starts off with Fox News Sunday, and I'm going to keep this news summary playing all the way to the end because I thought, they're focusing on this Texas synagogue standoff. I guess they're not going to they're not going to continue the drumbeat of all week where Biden's terrible worst week or whatever, terrible, horrible, no good, whatever that phrase is from that kid's book. But they did actually, I'll play this to the end and you'll see it, but the propaganda has to do with this Texas synagogue standoff. If you go down to the link I put under sources in the video description and you watch the interview on CBS this morning, Gayle King with the rabbi, you'll see that the rabbi actually, the hostage taker freed one person during negotiations, and then the last three hostages, the rabbi threw a chair at the hostage taker and they ran out and escaped, after which the police came in, and the most I've heard, they say there were gunshots and the hostage taker was killed, but it doesn't say even whether the police killed him or he killed himself. That I don't know whether that's true or not, but the coverage yesterday on the Sunday news programs all made it sound like the hostage rescue team rescued. So it makes it sound like they rescued the hostages, which that's not what the rabbi said on CBS News this morning. and especially the Fox News and then the ABC This Week with George Stephanopoulos news summary is even worse than the Fox News Sunday one on this whole copaganda thing. But just listen. I mean, the copaganda is obvious. Let me make clear. I was raised a Reformed Jew, though I'm an agnostic atheist for many, many years. I belong to a synagogue. I'm not on the side of the synagogue shooter. I'm just trying to talk about the media bias and the pro-cop bias when I don't think the cops did as good a job and they rarely do as good a job as the media make it sound. And I'll talk about that a little more after we watch the Fox News Sunday news summary from Lucas Tomlinson and John Roberts yesterday morning over here.
Hello again from Fox News in Washington. We start with breaking developments out of Texas as law enforcement rescue a rabbi and 3 other hostages from a tense hours-long standoff at a synagogue in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. The FBI dispatching an elite hostage rescue team from Quantico, Virginia, to help with the situation. Let's now turn to Lucas Tomlinson. He's traveling to Wilmington, Delaware, where President Biden was monitoring the situation. Lucas has the latest for us. Hi, Lucas.
John, good news out of Texas this morning. All 4 hostages are alive. The suspect is dead.
Colleyville's one of the safest cities in Texas, and this is something that you don't ever expect to have in your own city. The rabbi is a personal friend of mine.
The standoff at the synagogue lasting nearly 11 hours. It began during a morning service at Congregation Beth Israel. It ended at 9 p.m. when members of the FBI's elite hostage rescue team stormed the synagogue. The daring raid launched 4 hours after one hostage released and debriefed. Texas Governor Greg Abbott tweeting, "Prayers answered." President Biden saying in a statement, quote, "There is more we will learn in the days ahead about the motivations of the hostage taker. But let me be clear to anyone who intends to spread hate, we will stand against anti-Semitism and against the rise of extremism in this country." Across the country, security stepped up at synagogues on the Jewish Sabbath. The Texas hostage crisis felt as far away as Israel. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett closely monitored the situation. The British government says the hostage taker was British. He demanded the release of Afia Siddiqui, a Pakistani neuroscientist educated at MIT and known in counterterrorism circles as Lady Al-Qaeda, currently serving an 86-year sentence in nearby Fort Worth for attempting to kill American soldiers in Afghanistan in 2008.
We'll continue to investigate the hostage taker. We'll continue to investigate his contacts. Our investigation will have global reach.
About a decade ago, the Taliban and ISIS made separate proposals to free American hostages in exchange for Siddiqui. Both offers were rejected by the U.S. government. John?
Lucas Tomlinson for us this morning from Wilmington, Delaware. Lucas, thank you. Now to the week in Washington. President Biden facing a stalled agenda and dropping poll numbers will this week face reporters in a rare formal news conference, just the 10th of his presidency and coming on the eve of his first year in office. Heading into the midterms, Republicans hope to seize the moment and borrow from the playbook laid out by Glenn Youngkin, sworn in Saturday as the 74th governor of the state of Virginia, flipping political control of a state that Joe Biden won by 10 points little more than a year ago.
I come to this moment and to this office knowing that we must bind the wounds of division, restore trust, find common cause for the common good, and strengthen the spirit of Virginia.
Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin joins us now exclusively from Richmond in his first television interview since taking office.
So yeah, there you can see the Fox News Sunday news summary. They had to stick in the anti-Biden talking points about his bad week, and I mean, not that they're false, but they're just constant on Fox News at the end there. But you heard about the daring rescue of the hostages after one hostage was released. There was a daring rescue. Well, that's not really what happened, at least not according to what the rabbi who was held hostage told CBS this morning. So that was copaganda, like I promised you earlier. And it's not just Fox News. Over here on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, Martha Raddatz has on the reporter, Mireya Villarreal, and then this hostage rescue effort, Brad Garrett is like a stand-up comedian who I actually saw many years ago as a stand-up comedian. Then he went on to be Ray Barone's brother in Everybody Loves Raymond, but no, it's not that Brad Garrett, but this Brad Garrett, and what kind of he like makes up this whole like hypothetical like heroic thought process of the police and how they were like did such a great job like knowing everything that was going on. And they even show video here that apparently, at least according to what the rabbi said this morning, is out of order. They show like the police going in with the flashbangs and then the hostages, the last 3 hostages, running out the door. But it actually was in the opposite order. I mean, maybe the hostages made it out the door because they might have been farther in the building, but the hostages escaped. The last 3 hostages escaped, like I said, before the police went in, which is obviously the opposite of what you're seeing from ABC and the copaganda that I promised you at the beginning of This Week with George Stephanopoulos yesterday morning over here.
Good morning and welcome to This Week. We're going to get to all those challenges facing the administration in a moment, but we begin with breaking news. After a dramatic late-night standoff, authorities in the Dallas-Fort Worth area rescued a rabbi and 3 other hostages at the Congregation Beth Israel Synagogue, with all hostages safe and the suspect confirmed dead. A full investigation is now underway into the suspect's motives. President Biden releasing a statement condemning the rise of extremism. Our Mireya Villarreal is on the scene in Texas with the very latest. Good morning, Mireya.
Good morning, Martha. As you can see behind me, police have this whole area blocked off. It'll stay like this most of the day as they continue their investigation. The good news, this morning, all 4 hostages are safe and the gunman dead after the standoff at a North Texas synagogue ended in dramatic fashion. The FBI hostage negotiating team stepping in to help, with agents candidly saying last night this could have ended badly if they hadn't started that communication early and continued to talk with the hostage taker throughout the day. The situation began Saturday morning at Congregation Beth Israel when the suspect interrupted a scheduled service that was being streamed on Facebook Live. Law enforcement officials telling ABC News the suspect claimed he had explosives in his backpack and was demanding the release of convicted terrorist Afia Siddiqui, who was sentenced to 86 years in federal prison for attempted murder of a U.S. soldier. FBI agents now, as well as local law enforcement, are trying to figure out the connection between Siddiqui and the hostage taker. Her attorney saying last night that there is no connection. She doesn't know him. He is not a relative. Also condemning his actions, calling them heinous and wrong. Martha?
Thank you, Mireya. I know you will stay on it. Let's bring in ABC News contributor Brad Garrett, a hostage negotiator for the FBI for 17 years. Brad, why did the SWAT team make that decision to move in when they did? And walk us through that exclusive, extraordinary video shot by our affiliate WFAA as the raid was going down.
So, Martha, at some point between the hostage negotiators and the hostage rescue team, they decided this guy's not coming out. We're not going to meet his demands about possibly having somebody released from a prison. And so they figure out a plan. Where is he in the building? How can we get into the building quickly and either arrest him or kill him? And my guess is they figured out where he was in the building through cameras. They make an entry. And what's interesting, as you look at the tape of them entering the building, there is a flash. That's a flashbang. And they throw those to distract everybody because they're very loud and they're very bright. And so you go in the door immediately when it goes off. And because they probably knew where they were going, they went directly to him and shot him, I presume.
And Brad, multiple law enforcement officials have told us that the hostage taker was demanding that a woman named Afia Siddiqui.
So yeah, at the very end of that clip there, you saw hostages running out, the last 3, but it was a different shot from the one where the cops went in. And I mean, I'm not positive that they're backwards chronologically. I mean, I know, or at least according to the rabbi's interview this morning on CBS this morning, he said they escaped before the cops came in. I don't know if they ran out the door before the cops came in, but that's the way CBS described it this morning, that they came out, and then later the cops went in, and shots were fired, and the hostage taker was killed. It doesn't even say who fired the shots, and who killed the hostage taker. It might have been a suicide, but those facts are still coming out. But anyway, I think you can see the copaganda was even worse there with Brad Garrett, not of Everybody Loves Raymond, coming up with this whole like hypothetical heroic thought process of the police, or I don't know, heroic, but hyper competent, when it doesn't sound. I mean, I'm not saying the police did nothing during this 11-hour standoff, but it sounds like the freedom of. I mean, they got one hostage released of the 4 during the negotiations, but the other 3 escaped. Anyway, I think I've talked about that, other than to say Jake Tapper has a milder form of this. I guess what he says about the synagogue standoff is a little bit ambiguous. He says the hostages were freed. There was one hostage freed. 3 of them escaped. But anyway, here's the final news summary on that topic over here.
Hello, I'm Jake Tapper in Washington, where the state of our union is grateful 4 hostages are free this morning after a nearly 11-hour standoff at the Congregation Beth Israel Synagogue in Colleyville, Texas. The lone suspect is now dead. In a statement, President Biden thanked law enforcement and decried anti-Semitism and the rise of extremism in America. And as the nation marks the birth this weekend of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., someone who fought to end hate and expand civil rights, the president and Democrats are facing the difficult reality that their hopes to pass sweeping election reform bills are all but dead. Tuesday, the Senate will take up their legislation, but it is expected to fail without the support of any Republicans and the refusal by 2 Democratic senators to change the rules of the Senate to pass the bill with just 51 votes as opposed to 60. It will be a devastating blow for President Biden's agenda and also his political capital after President Biden put the weight of his office and his reputation as a unifier behind the rules change, delivering a withering speech in Atlanta aimed at opponents of election reform and the filibuster change, and going to Capitol Hill Thursday to rally his party, and still failing to convince Senators Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, as well as perhaps other Democratic senators, to change the filibuster rules. Joining me now, someone who has been fighting for election reform and voting rights his entire career, the House Majority Leader.
And like I said, Jim Clyburn was on a couple shows. I don't have a clip of him, but you saw Jake Tapper. Well, I guess maybe he said hostages free, not freed, so that might be accurate. Free is accurate. Freed, not so much. But then he goes in and he accurately reports the defeats of the Biden administration. There's nothing wrong. It's just because Fox News does it all the time, even when they're not defeats, that doesn't mean it's wrong to report it when it actually happens. And then the final news summary, this is something that news organizations do, which, I don't know, it seems to be overemphasizing something that's not all that newsworthy, where, I guess it's another way of looking at the defeats of the Biden administration, but focusing on the latest poll numbers, bad poll numbers for the Biden administration as news, which is what Margaret Brennan did in this 40-second news summary before they had on Anthony Salvanto, their poll expert, which I didn't take, but I'll talk about a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
Good morning and welcome to Face the Nation. Thursday will mark the first full year since President Biden took office, and a new CBS News poll shows Americans think he's not focused enough on key issues like the economy and inflation. 44% of Americans approve of the job he's doing overall, with a split on his handling of the coronavirus. When it comes to Mr. Biden's efforts on the economy, just over a third, 38%, approve. His handling of inflation is worse. 7 in 10 Americans disapprove. We turn now to CBS News Elections and Surveys Director Anthony Salvanto. Good morning to you, Anthony.
And if you want to see that Anthony Salvanto clip or any other part of Face the Nation, as I always point out, at the link down under sources is the CBS News Face the Nation YouTube channel, where the entire program is split into clips, including that segment on the new CBS News poll, which, I don't know, doesn't seem that, it's just a snapshot of a statistical possible opinion survey or whatever. I mean, it's meaningful for the moment it's taken from the people it's taken from, and to the extent that they're representative, which has to do with sampling and statistics and everything. And some are better than others. But is it really like the top news story to begin the program with? You can let me know what you think in the comments section. And now I'm going to get to my two topics. First, voting rights, and then COVID forever. And the first clip I'm going to show, I actually have some criticism for Jake Tapper. I usually think he's one of the best cross-examiners on the Sunday shows. But here he's talking to Bill Cassidy, senator from Louisiana. He introduces the problems going on with voting rights legislation. And I think he lets him get away with, talking about the founding fathers and talking about the how things have changed since 1965 in the when the Voting Rights Act was passed. But it was last reauthorized with almost unanimous Republican support in 2006. He doesn't really talk about that, and I don't want to totally pre-criticize the clip, so I will talk about the problems with Jake Tapper's cross-examination of Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana a little more after we watch that clip I picked out for you today over here.
Welcome back to State of the Union. I'm Jake Tapper. On Tuesday, Senate Democrats plan to take up the election reform bills they say are needed to protect American democracy, but they will fail those bills because the legislation is opposed by every Republican senator, and two Democrats join them in not wanting to change the filibuster rules. Joining us now to talk about why is Republican Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana. Senator, thanks for joining us. So President Biden held a rally in Georgia this week urging senators to pass Democrats' election reform legislation and to change the filibuster rules to allow them to do so. Take a listen.
I ask every elected official in America, how do you want to be remembered? Do you want to be on the side of Dr. King or George Wallace? Do you want to be on the side of John Lewis or Bull Connor? Do you want to be on the side of Abraham Lincoln or Jefferson Davis?
You just heard Congressman Clyburn say that those remarks, in his view, do not go too far. He argued that the real focus should be on what he believes are the discriminatory election laws being passed in places like Georgia, not on Biden's words. What do you think?
Most of what in all due respect, most of what Representative Clyburn said was wrong or misleading. If these laws are constitutional, they'll be struck down. He's implying they won't be. They're not criminalizing giving people water. They're just saying you can't walk up to them just before they walk in, give them a piece of water, and tell them who to vote for. You can still give water to the people working at the poll. They can distribute it. There are several other things he said that are misleading, and so did President Biden. Now, if you're trying to call the United States of America to unity, trying to get us to where we will come to common ground, you don't end up spreading things that are untrue or frankly lies. And that's why people think we need the filibuster. Otherwise, you're just totally rolled by somebody who's willing to sacrifice truth to pursue their agenda.
The Senate's going to take up the Democrats' election reform bills this week. A key part, one of them, is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which would restore provisions of the landmark 1965 Voting Rights Act that protect against discriminatory state election laws. When the Senate reauthorized that law just a decade ago, it passed 98-0. Why don't Republicans, including yourself, support restoring the Voting Rights Act now?
So the Supreme Court decided that the conditions in 1965 are different than they are now. Imagine that. We've had an African-American elected president of the United States, an African-American elected to the vice presidency, an African-American elected to the Senate in South Carolina. Now, if anyone can't see that circumstances have changed, they're just not believing their lying eyes. The reality is that in Louisiana, we have the highest percent of African-American officials in the nation. We've had a white mayor of a predominantly black city and a black mayor of a predominantly white city. There's been incredible progress in our country. There's more to do. Absolutely. We need safeguards. But to argue we are still the same as we were in 1965 is to deny facts that are clearly before us.
But isn't the argument not that it's the same as 1965, but that discrimination and prejudices continue to exist? Voting rights activists will point to, for example, the state of Texas moved to ban drive-through and 24-hour early voting, which were heavily used by minority voters in 22, to limit the number of drop boxes to just one per county. In Georgia, where the Atlanta region went from having more than 100 drop boxes to just 23, and where there's strict new ID requirements for absentee ballots that disproportionately impact minority voters. And beyond that, there were some of the pieces of legislation that were parts of those voting reform packages in Texas and Georgia that did not ultimately pass, but seemed to really have ill intent at their root. For example, banning Sunday voting, which would have disproportionately affected souls to the polls movements by black churches to go from church to get people to vote. Ultimately didn't become law, but that really alarmed a lot of people at what the intent might have been.
I don't know what to say. This proves the system works. My gosh, now Georgia has 2 days of Sunday voting that is optional, that you can do it. And by the way, there were no drop boxes before the pandemic. There were none. And now we still have drop boxes. So an accommodation made for a pandemic are going to continue in the future when theoretically the pandemic is over. And shall I point out that Georgia has more early voting days than does Delaware or New York by far. They have no excuse absentee voting. So when Representative Clyburn says the 90-year-old woman has to stand in line for 4 hours, in Georgia she doesn't. I think in Delaware she might have to, or New York. So maybe we need to start looking at the blue states, which have not been nearly so reactive and supportive of voting as opposed to a state like Georgia, which clearly has relative to them.
This push by Democrats in the Senate comes as...
So, yeah, I did not think that that was the greatest cross-examination by Jake Tapper. First, he let him get away with saying that it was wrong that you couldn't give people water, and it was illegal to give people water in line. Well, he said piece of water. I don't even know what that means, piece of water. And that actually is something that's been outlawed in Georgia. And the other thing that I thought was wrong was that he was talking about the Supreme Court decision saying that things had changed since 1965, but Jake Tapper never brought up again that the last reauthorization, he brought up the 98-0 reauthorization a decade ago. I think it was actually in 2006. But didn't bring up the fact that that's not 1965. That's Congress authorizing the Voting Rights Act in 2006. And what it did, what the Supreme Court struck down in Shelby County versus Holder by a 5-4 decision, was it used to be that areas that had a history of discrimination, not New York and Delaware, although their Central California was one of the places that had to get pre-clearance. If they changed their voting rights in a way that might disproportionately impact people who've been discriminated against, they had to get pre-clearance from the Justice Department, and that's been struck down. But also in that Supreme Court decision, it said that if Congress made specific findings and updated their findings, then it would be constitutional. So Jake Tapper could have brought that up and didn't bring it up to, that whole thing where he said, the Supreme Court decided, even said it twice to emphasize it. And, things are different now because President Obama was elected, and President, and Kamala Harris is Vice President, and Raphael Warnock. But that's the other quote that I think Jake Tapper should have brought up and should always be brought up when Republicans make that kind of argument, is the quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, her dissent in Shelby County versus Holder, where she said, the majority opinion is like someone who throws away their umbrella in the rain because they argue they're not getting wet. And the Voting Rights Act was the umbrella, and just the racial discriminatory intent or racial discriminatory impact of these voting suppression laws or voting integrity laws, I guess Republicans call it. That's the rain that's getting us wet, and that's why we need that umbrella. But anyway, so that's my criticism of Jake Tapper's cross-examination there. I also have criticism of Chuck Todd's cross-examination of Mitt Romney. he's the one who I think talks about the founding fathers, although he also kind of makes some news here and maybe shows a mistake of the Biden administration that he didn't reach out to Republicans apparently on trying to get voting right. Not even more moderate Republicans like Mitt Romney, and I'll talk about that a little more after we watch Chuck Todd's interview with Mitt Romney on the topic of voting rights from yesterday together over here.
President calls you up tomorrow and says, Senator Romney, I'd like to figure out something on voting rights. Can we sit down and have a conversation? You heard Jim Clyburn about the Electoral Vote Act. It may not be what some want on the left, but is that a place to begin? And would you participate in that process?
Yeah, and Chuck, I already am. The group of about 12 senators, Republicans and Democrats, that are working on the Electoral Count Act will continue to work together. Sadly, this election reform bill that the president has been pushing, I never got a call on that from the White House. There was no negotiation bringing Republicans and Democrats together to try and come up with something that would meet bipartisan interest. Sure, we can work together on almost every issue where there's common ground. I would note on this that on the bill they put together, that they want a real dramatic change, which is they feel that instead of elections being run at the state level, they should really be managed and run at the federal level. And recognize the founders didn't have that vision in mind. They didn't want an autocrat to be able to pull a lever in one place and change all the election laws. Instead, they spread that out over 50 states, I think in part to keep autocracy from finding its root here in this country. So we can work together, and I think it's important to reform the Electoral Count Act to do so.
Look, I understand you don't want to federalize elections. Are you comfortable with creating sort of floors, that you got to offer, that you shouldn't take Jim Clyburn's complaint that basically African Americans spend longer in line than other voters? If you have a state that has that issue, are you for a baseline that says, hey, you can't have those discrepancies? We're not going to tell you how to fix that discrepancy, but you have to fix that discrepancy. That's what the Voting Rights Act, some believe, is for. Are you in favor of things like that?
Well, the answer is of course, and that's what exists in the 1965 voting rights legislation that is still the law of the land. And that is, you cannot have practices which discriminate against people based upon their ethnicity. And that's why the Justice Department is using that act actually as we speak to go after one state that has apparently, according to the Justice Department, gone across that line. So we have laws that prevent discrimination based upon race, and that should be the case. But what I think we have to point out here is that a state like Georgia, which everybody's talking about because the president went there, it's easier to vote in Georgia, even under the new legislation, than it is to vote in Delaware.
Right.
Or to vote in New York,
right,
or to vote in New Jersey. And no one is saying that, oh, New York has discriminatory practices. No, New York's practices are more stringent, more difficult to vote there than Georgia. So this is clearly a political play to appeal to a base in the Democratic Party, and an effort to really work at a bipartisan basis hasn't happened yet.
Senator, two quick questions before I let you go. Senator Lindsey.
So, yeah, if Mitt Romney wants to make it easier to vote in Delaware or New York or New Jersey, I'm all for that. And, I mean, I think there are a lot of things that would make it easier to vote in those states, too, like making it a national holiday. Voting day should be a national holiday. People shouldn't have to work or try to get time off of work to vote. There are all sorts of nice reforms. There's getting rid of the gerrymander, the partisan gerrymandering is also in the election reforms, and of course Chuck Todd never brought any of that up. But the main thing that I thought that, and I hear this all the time, that the founding fathers didn't want us to have elections controlled at a federal level. And that's true, that the Founding Fathers didn't want to have a lot of things controlled at the federal level. Even the Bill of Rights itself, those rights only applied to the federal government at the time of the founding. There's this Supreme Court case I've talked about before, Barron versus Baltimore, where the Supreme Court said, the Founding Fathers thought that the states being closer to the people were better guarantors of individual rights, and so they didn't need the federal government to come in and protect them. But that turned out to be wrong. And that's why we had to fight the Civil War, because a lot of states decided they weren't going to protect people's rights better. They were going to protect some people's rights a lot worse than they should have. And what happened after the Civil War? Well, if you have your handy-dandy ACLU Constitution, which I send out to people who on Patreon or through PayPal, it links down in the video description, send at least $5 and a shipping address. I will send you this ACLU Constitution for yourself, and you can see the 14th and 15th Amendments. And what does the 14th Amendment say? It says that no state can deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor to deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. And it also says that in the last section 5, it says Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provision of this article. So making sure everyone has equal rights, that no state denies anyone their liberties, which includes the right to vote. That's it. One of the things that the right to vote is something that states can't deny you, even though it's not written into the Constitution. But then what does it say in the 15th Amendment? Have you ever read the 15th Amendment? It's much shorter. The 15th Amendment says, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That's Section 1. Section 2, the Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So the Founding Fathers made some mistakes, and those were fixed after the Civil War, that gave the Congress the power to federalize elections when states were trying to do racist things to deny people the right to vote. And that's right in the Constitution. It's right in the 15th Amendment specifically, and more generally in the 14th Amendment. And I know Mitt Romney knows that, so he's being kind of disingenuous. He's still a partisan Republican, even if he's an anti-Trumper, like I was saying. But anyway, that's my criticism of Chuck Todd and his cross-examination of Mitt Romney there. Now I want to get over to Tim Kaine over on CBS News' Face the Nation. He's being cross-examined by Margaret Brennan about the strategy of the Democrats, and chances don't look good. That's why in the title I've said voting rights are dead. Voting rights legislation look dead because there aren't 50 Democrats willing to change the rules to get it passed, at least so far. I don't know, maybe they'll turn to the talking filibuster or whatever. But anyway, I'll let you watch Tim Kaine talk about that with Margaret Brennan and discuss it with you a little more before we get to the then the Senator Bill, then to the COVID clips. But anyway, here's the last voting rights clip that I'll talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
Democratic strategist James Carville was on another network this morning, and he said Democrats whine too much. He said you're not talking. He said you're not talking enough about the infrastructure bill you just passed. You're talking about things that have failed, and you have a vote scheduled this week that will also fail on voting rights. Why do you think that is an effective strategy to have high-profile failures rather than talk about the things that people are saying do matter to them on the economy and inflation?
Well, Margaret, I do think we are talking a lot about the infrastructure bill. Certainly I am in Virginia, and whether it's broadband, road, rail, bridges, ports, airports, electricity grid, it's going to mean a lot of good for every zip code in the country. With respect to voting rights, look, whatever the pundits say, makes political sense. It is such an existential issue. Those of us who survived the attack on the Capitol January 6th and are witnessing wholesale efforts around the country to make it harder for people to vote and to undermine the integrity of elections, we have to do this. We all have to be recorded at this moment in time about where are we in protecting the right to vote. Right now, it doesn't look like it has the votes to pass, but we're going to cancel our Martin Luther King Day recess and be there this week because we think it's so important for the country. And we will be voting both on the bills, but also on if we can't get Republican support for the bills, we have uniform Democratic support. Could we find a path to make some rules adjustments to pass them?
But you don't have the votes to suspend that 60-vote threshold. So what kind of mechanism are you envisioning here that's somehow going to get this through?
As of right now, Margaret, we don't have all 50 Democrats on board with rules changes, but there are a couple of different paths. Some involve rules changes like a carve out to the filibuster, but there's other paths that we could take where the 60-vote threshold is only if you want to limit debate. We could do longer debate and then end the debate and have a simple majority. But we will have a vote on the bills, and we will have a vote on a rules path to get there because it's so important for the country.
The president, as you know, gave this very high-profile speech this past week in Georgia. He's called the local law there Jim Crow 2.0. In that speech that he gave, he compared his opponents to Bull Connor, Jefferson Davis, which Republican leader Mitch McConnell said was akin to saying, agree with me or you are a bigot. How does characterizing opponents like that actually win over any kind of Republican support? Isn't the president hobbling himself?
You know, Margaret, I read those comments differently. Joe Biden was tough in his words, but I think what he said is in the 1960s, say the Voting Rights Act of 1965, people, including people of goodwill, had to decide were they going to stand on the side of Bull Connor or stand on the side of John Lewis. It was the same point that Martin Luther King made in his famous letter to the Birmingham jail. He said, I'm writing to people of goodwill. You may not be bigots and you may not be pro-discrimination, but this is a moment in time where you have to decide which side you're going to stand with. In these efforts to hobble minority votes and put up stunts and schemes in people's way, all people of goodwill have to decide where they're going to stand.
So you disagree with Senator Dick Durbin, who said the president may have gone too far there. I mean, is there any outreach to Republicans here who have signaled some willingness on the Electoral Count Act or other measures?
Margaret, I've been engaged in outreach to Republicans on voting rights since July and have found zero support. With the exception of Senator Lisa Murkowski, who is a co-sponsor of the John Lewis bill, we can get no co-sponsors despite repeated efforts. When we put the bill up on the floor to proceed to it, they vote against even debating the bill, knowing that they could block its passage. They don't even want to talk about it. So I thank Senator Murkowski for being a supporter of restoring the preclearance provisions in the John Lewis bill. But thus far, she's been the only one who has been willing to put her name to support for any of these provisions.
Yeah.
So there's the Tim Kaine defense, kind of a stand-in for the Representative Jim Clyburn clips that I didn't take from a couple different shows. Margaret Brennan, I think, did a pretty good job there of bringing out the problems in the strategy in terms of not having enough votes to change the rules so that only 50 Democrats can pass voting rights legislation, and then not having, other than Lisa Murkowski, not having any Republicans willing to go along with even the least of the voting rights protections. So I don't know, but then there's going to be a vote tomorrow, which apparently where the legislation is going to fail, and then there are going to be a couple pathways. They talked about how instead of having a vote to end debate, just letting debate go on, and then I don't know if that's going to be the standing filibuster, like the Mr. Smith goes to Washington type filibuster. That, I mean, I wish Margaret Brennan had asked some questions about that in terms to get more details, because I know that at least Senator Manchin has said that he'd be willing to reform the filibuster, at least to the extent of requiring the senators to actually stand and debate when they're, because that's what the filibuster is supposed to be. It's supposed to be, at least, well, there's a filibuster that won't let you even start debate on a bill, but they have a way around that. But then the second filibuster says that unless you get 60 votes, debate on the bill never ends. And it used to be that senators would have to hold the floor and just speak on and on and on, and then when they couldn't anymore, then you would actually get a vote and it could pass by a majority vote. So I suppose that may be one glimmer of hope that says that voting rights legislation isn't dead, despite the title of my video. But that was the last of my clips on that topic. You can let me know what you think about it and about Margaret Brennan's cross-examination of Tim Kaine. In some ways, I think she did better than, Chuck Todd did with Mitt Romney, maybe, and Jake Tapper then did with Senator Bill Cassidy. But actually, the first clip I want to show you on the COVID topic is also Jake Tapper sort of cross-examining Senator Bill Cassidy. This is Jake Tapper asks Bill Cassidy about his opposition to COVID vaccine mandates and what he proposes to do instead, because the vaccination rate's so bad in Louisiana. And then Jake Tapper tries to correct Senator Bill Cassidy, saying something about prior infection being as good in terms of immunity as vaccination. But I don't know, he seems to kind of back down, or I don't know, does he back down or doesn't he back down? You can let me know after you watch the clip. But you remember I talked about this last week, and I even showed you this page from the CDC website, and I put a link down in the video description again this week where you can see it, where if you look at the science, it actually says that, well, sometimes prior infection can be as good as vaccination. It's not as reliable as vaccination in terms of giving people that immunity. A lot of people can have prior infection and not have any immunity, while some people have strong immunity. It's a much wider range than vaccinated people who much more reliably have immunity. And it's also a much narrower immunity, in that the vaccinated immunity will give you protection against more variants than prior infection immunity, depending on which variant you were infected with, of course, but it doesn't carry across variants as well as vaccination. So those are the facts that are on the CDC website, and Jake Tapper should have been able to cross-examine Senator Bill Cassidy a little better with all the details of the facts that I just told you. He just says, well, that's not what the science says on the CDC website, but maybe he ran out of time. You can let me know what you think after we watch that clip together over here.
Lastly, sir, I do want to ask you about COVID, which is half of the residents of your home state of Louisiana are still unvaccinated. Now, I understand you don't support vaccine mandates. What do you propose instead? How can we ever get out of this pandemic if millions of people throughout the country, including Louisiana, continue to refuse to get the vaccine?
A couple of things. I do not support federal vaccine mandates. That's never been the case before. On a state, local level, a business and a school, they have a right to do so. The federal government never has before, and I oppose that, number one. Number two, we should acknowledge, the medical literature does, previous infection grants immunity. So when we speak of statistics, let's also include those who've been previously infected. Now, they may still be infected with Omicron, but they're not going to go to the hospital. And by the way, we also have to acknowledge that someone who's elderly and vaccinated is at greater risk of death from Omicron than someone who is younger and not vaccinated. So if we're honest with the American people, I think they'll start responding a little bit better. Lastly, this whole kind of shortage of tests, the administration's lost focus. That's not something you deliver just in time. It's something you have a big warehouse. Whenever you need it, you shove it out, but you immediately refill it. And the administration needs to get warp speed back going, warehouse fulls of labs, and just begin to have statistics that are meaningful to the American people, as opposed to those which they think are trying to roll them.
All right, Senator Cassidy, thanks so much. I do want to note that while previous infection does provide some protection against another infection, vaccines, as I'm sure you'll agree, provide more protection than having been infected.
I don't know that. I don't know that.
Well, that's according to this.
The medical literature suggests that.
Okay.
Yeah, the medical literature suggests that previous infection can be quite as effective as a vaccine.
All right, I've seen CDC studies that suggest otherwise, but Senator Cassidy, Dr. Cassidy, thanks so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Is the U.S.
So I don't know, did Jake Tapper back down because Senator Bill Cassidy is also Dr. Bill Cassidy? And you see, I think he's almost being dishonest there, Bill Cassidy, because he said that he started to say that a prior infection is quite as effective, and then he caught himself and said can be quite as effective. And that actually is true, because like I said before, for some people it's as good, but it's not as reliably good as the vaccine, and it can be narrower in terms of which variants it gives you immunity for. And it, like I said, I put a link down in the video description. You can look at the peer-reviewed scientific studies yourself, and you'll see that vaccination is more reliable and more gives you a wider protection than prior infection. I mean, you might be okay. You might be just as good as vaccinated. You might be one of the lucky ones, but as a general rule, it's not true. So those are the facts. And I don't know, did Jake do a good enough job? I don't think he did, actually, but you can let me know what you think in the comment section. I've been reading your live comments along the way. I appreciate those of you who've been joining in. The Lulu girl gave me a super chat contribution. I appreciate that, and I thank you for thanking me. There was one thing I was going to say about the voting rights thing. Oh, Tom Trask was saying how there were already ballot boxes before COVID, because one of the Republicans was saying we just did ballot boxes or ballot drop boxes for COVID. Well, I mean, here in California, we've had mail-in in Sacramento County, and I think it was 5 counties we started with, and now we have universal mail-in in California. So we've had drop boxes. That's part of mail-in, because you don't just have to put it in the mail. They even have local drop boxes for California. So that was before COVID, and I know Oregon has complete mail-in, and I don't know if they have drop boxes or if it's just mail boxes. But anyway, I appreciate that support on my voting rights commentary, because I did forget to mention that as a mistake that the Republican commentators made. And anyway, I do have a couple more COVID clips that I wanted to talk about, and this next one, I think that Martha Raddatz lets Tom Bossert, who used to be Trump's Homeland Security advisor and was Trump's Homeland Security advisor at the beginning of COVID, and then he quit and became a commentator, and he was critical of the Trump administration. But this whole interview, first he makes this news that is kind of startling. It's like this terrible utilitarian Malthusian type logic where, we don't care how many people get killed as long as we spread it out over 2 years, presumably so it doesn't overwhelm the healthcare system. I mean, there is a little bit of value in having the deaths spread out over 2 years so that people suffering other illnesses can still go to the hospital. Less people will die overall, I guess. But you'll see Thomas Bossert in his answer to Martha Raddatz here kind of reveals that the Trump administration expected 1 million people to die, and we just wanted to flatten the curve, slow it down. That's what we used to talk about at the beginning of the pandemic. Flatten the curve so the healthcare system isn't overwhelmed. But the thing about flattening the curve is you want to do it in a way so that less people die, not so that the same number of people die over a longer period of time. So Martha Raddatz, you'll see, lets Tom Bossert say that startling thing without any follow-up. I mean, she changes the subject to messaging, and they talk about messaging in a way where she lets Tom Bossert, who worked for Donald Trump, criticize the Biden administration's messaging on COVID. Remember, the kill it with sunlight or maybe bleach or whatever, that Trump administration, Trump who would never wear a mask till the very almost near the end of his presidency, and many months would never be seen wearing a mask. And so Tom Bossert gets away with talking, and I'm going to contrast this with a better response on Fox News Sunday, but from the guest, not the host, of course. But anyway, here is that startling admission from Thomas Bossert, followed by a disingenuous attack on the Biden administration's messaging without acknowledging the mistakes of the Trump administration over here.
Let's get some analysis from Tom Bossert, who served as White House Homeland Security Advisor to 2 presidents and led the development of our country's pandemic response plan. It's great to see you this morning, Tom. You were a leading voice in trying to tell people about the risks of COVID and what went wrong in the last response. Here we are again. You heard Dr. Murthy. What's your take on this?
Martha, you know, not only are we here again, but before we talk about all the things that went wrong, I'm struck by how much went right. A lot of people in this country have contributed and played their role, not just public health officials and public health care officials like Dr. Murthy, but average Americans who are all masking and social distancing. And think how much worse it would be if we had let all 1 million deaths, and I think we will approach 1 million deaths here, to take place all in 1 year or one period of time. We've spread it over 2 years, which was part of the original goal, and we've developed a vaccine. And without 9 billion doses of that vaccine delivered, we'd have a lot worse of a problem. But frankly, I wouldn't be here if things were going well. And I was understanding but a little disappointed in what I heard from Dr. Murthy. Essentially, in order to maintain trust, he needs to acknowledge some failure here. We've ordered too few testing kits, so our testing capacity has continued to lag behind each wave. It's too little and too late, but noteworthy for the next wave. We've ordered too few and too little treatments, and we don't have yet a global distribution and delivery plan for vaccines. So there's a lot that we can work on, as he acknowledged. But for right now, Americans that are frustrated and giving up, I think they need to hear that a return to some rigor in our social distancing is necessary, because our hospital beds, and more importantly, our hospital ICU beds, are filling up, and in some states are completely full.
And messaging and public trust is so important in this, and the messaging has been confusing.
The federal government really has 2 big primary roles. The first is procuring these vaccines and treatments, and we've made some significant mistakes there and failed to make big bets. The doctor mentioned that we've got another Merck drug that we've ordered, but they ordered that one early in the test trial phase. That's what they should have done with Paxlovid. They waited 6 months for 2nd and 3rd phase trials, and they shouldn't have done that. And so now the messaging breaks that public trust. Admit that, and I think they'd earn some trust, and we'd be able to move forward. If we change our messaging, vacillate on our belief set, lose sight of our common purpose or goal, people pick up on that and they don't trust anymore. So, in fact, I tell people that in a crisis, which is what this is, clear and consistent messaging, telling people what you know and don't know, and acknowledging mistakes and moving on are the 3 keys to maintaining trust. And if you break any one of them, you'll have a harder time with the underlying core response plan and its execution.
Always great to have your analysis. Thanks so much, Tom Bossert.
So there you see the Trump administration official. I mean, he worked for 2 presidents, but former Trump administration official criticizing Biden for, about, like, you have to have clear, consistent messaging. You have to be able to admit your mistakes and all that. And, well, and then I also talked about how at the beginning of the clip he talked about flattening the curve with how it was the plan for 1 million people to die all along, and Martha Raddatz didn't follow up on that, let him get away with the messaging criticism of Biden without talking about the problems with Trump messaging. And that's one of the things that's been pervasive throughout the media. I guess even polling shows that Americans think the Biden administration messaging on COVID is confusing. You heard Martha Raddatz say that. And John Roberts over on Fox News Sunday, in the final Newsmaker clip I'm going to show you, tries to make that same point with the dean of the Brown University School of Public Health, Ashish Jha. But he has a much better comeback and says some of the things that Martha Raddatz probably should have said to Tom Bossert. And it's you got to love this clip. I almost use this for the political comedy clip, which I will end the program before my bonus Dash and Sandy or Dandy clip for the Dash and Sandy fans out there. But here's the final newsmaker clip to talk about a little more after we watch it together over here.
I want to ask you about the messaging that's coming from the government and what you make of it. I mean, it seems to be about as clear as mud. And it was really highlighted at that Senate hearing last week. And we want to put up a side-by-side picture here. You had the head of the CDC, Rochelle Walensky, double masked while she was speaking, giving her testimony before the Senate. And then we had Anthony Fauci take his mask off when he was giving testimony. So do you leave the mask on? Do you take the mask off? What kind of mask should you wear? Apparently cloth masks aren't very good now at dealing with Omicron. The CDC just came out with that information on Friday. We don't know where to get tests. We're not sure what test to get. We're not sure how long to isolate, when to come out of isolation, what to do after we come out of isolation. Can you make head or tail of what the government is talking about?
Yeah, so we have different agencies that have not been on the same page, John, and I think that part has been a real problem. What we know right now, right, is that people should be masking indoors, especially when you're in large, crowded spaces. That makes a lot of sense. We are switching, I think, from using those PCR tests on a regular basis to using those rapid antigen tests more commonly. I think that's what's going to become more common. And so the science here is changing. I think the messaging has not kept up.
So what's the problem? I mean, during the Trump administration, you might not have liked what you heard, but as we were talking before we came on, you had one message that was going out. Now you've got multiple messages. There's multiple messages that are often contradictory with each other.
Yeah, I think what happened on the Trump administration was you had, as you said, one messenger, President Trump. And he often said things that were wrong, but at least there was one single message. Right now you have CDC, you have the White House, you have FDA, you have NIH. I think the White House needs to get its messaging discipline together. It needs to make sure that people are speaking from the same page. My sense is that that has not been happening consistently, and it would be enormously helpful to the American people if that messaging was more consistent.
So all of this muddled messaging, is it creating problems?
Well, it's certainly making it harder for people to know what to do. And in a public health crisis like the one we have, getting the public to understand the moment we're in, what are the key things they need to be doing to keep themselves and their families safe, is enormously important. And if we don't get that messaging right, it will absolutely hamper our response.
Yeah, with Omicron's virulence vastly attenuated from...
So, yeah, that was a great response from Dr. Ashish Jha about how, yeah, the Trump administration had one message. It was often wrong, but one message. And John Roberts he didn't even really acknowledge that and just like went on. That was kind of funny. Here's Sandy the dog wants to be fed, so she's whining and just lying down here. Before I get to the Dash and Sandy clip, I did promise last week I'd tell you all a little bit about this district attorney candidate forum I've been working on. I guess I checked, I've been working since like the end of last April, so for a better part of a year on this with a bunch of other local community activists. This is a public event, so if you want to see, this is Sacramento County District Attorney race here in California. I think maybe it's like 51 of 53 counties have their district attorneys up for election in June of 2022, including here in Sacramento County. So, and our district attorney isn't running for re-election. Anne-Marie Schubert is actually running for Attorney General of California, and don't even get me started on Anne-Marie Schubert. But here, let me see if I can... So here's like the online flyer for the event. Can you even see that? It's not all fitting into the picture. It's those are the candidates and stuff. And if you're interested in attending and watching and seeing, this is co-hosted by the ACLU and a bunch of other groups. I don't know. Can I change? Can I make it? What if I do it like 40%? Oh, it's like just a square. Never mind. Anyway, if you want to register for that, That's the Sacramento County district. I don't know, just if you're interested, I know very few of you actually live in Sacramento County, but here I'll put a link in the live chat. This is the Zoom registration link. If you just want to see, there are already like 150 people going. We've been working on it really hard, and it's actually supposed to be the first of 3 debates. But anyway, I just wanted to let you all know about something I've been working on as an ACLU activist for, what is that, like 9 months since that, well, yeah, 8.5 months since the end of April 2021. So anyway, and now for the Dash and Sandy or Dandy fans out there, that's Dash my cat and Sandy the dog, who both are hanging in there despite being kind of elderly pets. One of the things I think that makes Sandy sad is that Sandy is not a jumping dog, never gets up on the bed, and Dash, now having recovered from his illness, is able to jump on the bed, and I have demonstrated that with a brief clip I took earlier today over here. I don't know, did Sandy look sad? I don't know, maybe not, I don't know. But I think Sandy is sad, and Sandy sometimes just whines because she can't get on the bed like Dash can. But anyway, that is the end of the program. I will be back next Monday and every Monday, probably through November 2022. I think I'm almost ready to commit to that. I've gotten some supportive comments from people on that, and even gotten some new patrons on Patreon. That is one of the things that makes me most optimistic about the future of doing this program. If you want to become a patron on Patreon, there's a link down in the video description, or direct PayPal contributions. Anyway, thank you all for joining me. I'll be back next Monday and every Monday for the foreseeable future, and until then, or until whatever, I guess I will be seeing all of you around the internet.